Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you again for all the hard work that's gone into the conference and to everyone who's presented so far. I've really had my mind stimulated by the thoughts that have come out, so I hope this won't be any different, although I think what I'm going to say is slightly different to what we've heard so far. I'm used to being at conferences that are about e-learning or even e-learning in languages and feeling it's not quite in the niche that I'm interested in of interpreting, and now I'm in a conference on interpreting and e-learning, and I feel like I'm focusing the most on the e-learning side in terms of the practicalities of what I'm going to share. This is really a very practical, hands-on summary of some of the lessons we've learnt in 8 years of localizing the ORCIT content. So the goal of what I want to share is really that for anyone interested in the kind of lessons we've learnt and applying them in any context, that there'll be something in here for you. I will be talking quite specifically about ORCIT and about our goals and from our perspective and the way we work, because I think if I try and pull it away too much and be too general, it's not really anchored in anything and a bit too abstract to be useful. But I hope that it will still be easy enough to then apply that or take out parts from it that will apply to whatever projects you are interested in working on in a multilingual context in terms of e-learning. So there's two aspects that I'd like to mention, and the first is the idea of actually localizing the content, and this is really what the partners do because in Leeds we create the templates and the partners do the localization. So I'd like to talk about some tips from that side, and then I'd like to talk about creating e-learning for localization. So best practice if you're creating something with the intent that it will be localized or adapted for other versions. One thing that it's always worth bearing in mind is the context of where you're working. And I'm not really going to use the slides too much. I've only got a couple of screenshots to illustrate. I thought I'd rather look at you than be fixated on what's on the screen. So in terms of context, for example, with ORCIT, the way we're working is we have 8 partners in different countries, quite spread apart, and each partner's creating or localizing the resources for their language. But you might be working in a setting where you're in one language department trying to create resources all for your own students that are available in different languages. Obviously, some of that will affect the way you look at that and the elements of what I'm going to share that are useful or that are most useful. So just to set the scene a bit, our workflow in ORCIT has changed a little bit from when we started. As I think Matthew mentioned briefly, we started ORCIT not necessarily knowing exactly how every aspect of it would work, and some of that we've picked up and adapted as we've learnt along the way. So initially, the first year, the 2 partners who are part of ORCIT, who were here from the beginning, are Leeds and Vilnius. And the first template that was created in English. We had the pedagogical input and the ideas we recorded. We created the resource, and once we were happy with it, we said, well, let's do the whole process over again with the Lithuanian team. And we really, they happened to be in Leeds for other reasons, so that was helpful, and we just re-recorded the same content that they had translated. It was later, as we had more partners, that we found that model isn't necessarily going to work as we expand. So the way it works now is the templates are produced in English, the idea, the concept, and the content, the pedagogical content is created, the scripts. These are brought together. With different resources, it might work slightly differently, the sort of mind mapping stage and how that all comes together, whether there's a very clear structure from the start or whether it builds as we go. And then the English template, once it's finally created and we're happy with it, is turned into translation files. So we, from that, create the templates that will be sent out. So nowadays, that will include a list of the different media that we need, what videos, what sound recordings. It will also include all the text that needs to be localized or adapted depending what the partners think will work best in their content once they look at the English template. And once partners have then localized, they've got the new text in the language, and they've also got the files, those will come back. They will be put together. Ideally, that would then be the end of it, but obviously we will need to go back and forth and check that this is all working well. And that's the main flow of how we put together our resources. But from an e-learning point of view, this does change sometimes. And now I'd like to move on to what I said I'd start with, the first element that I think is important to think of, which is how can you translate, how can you localize, what are some good tips that we have found as a team as we go along. And the first is linked to what Dragos said, that it's not just about the content, it's being adapted for your context. And some examples, we've had speeches, one of the speeches in the English resources, one of the earlier English resources is about Boy Scouts. And some partners said, well, we can't use that speech because in our context it doesn't really mean anything, it won't mean anything to our learners, so we're going to look for a different speech. And that's something very simple that the actual speech within that resource has changed. But it might be something visual, for example. We have some elements where there are illustrations, and this is where I'm going to bring in one tip that would have come in a bit later, but I think it works now as well, is thinking about what you're going to be localizing ahead of time. We have some illustrations. We had one part of one of the resources where we say, beware of red herrings. Beware when you're analyzing and listening of something that will be leading you up the wrong path. And the e-learning technologist who created that template came up with a lovely animation of a little red fish going across the screen, and it was wonderful. We loved it. But when it came to actually localizing and putting the context, there weren't many partners who had said, in their summaries, had used that same analogy of a red herring, because it obviously doesn't exist in as many languages. But our template, with our illustrations and our animations that our e-learning technologist had put so much time and effort into creating, had a red fish swimming across the screen at that part of the resource. So what do you do there? And that's one, as I say, I'll go into the tips. One of the areas where, as you're thinking about creating, it's a very different process if you're doing it for a monolingual resource compared to if you know that this is going to be localized. What elements do I pick out? Or which elements do I make visual? Is that going to cause problems later on? In terms of the actual technical resources you use when you're localizing, this again has changed. In ORCIT, initially, we used to take screenshots of every part of animation where there's something that might need to be localized, something that's coming up on the screen, and so partners would receive screenshots with a table underneath that have all the text, and then we'd receive those back with the translations. Nowadays, the technology that we use, the software that we mainly use for ORCIT, it's called Articulate Storyline, and I would recommend it because it's user-friendly. I've seen some examples of Storyline resources on the screen, so I think we may see some coming up later in the day. And one of the elements about that is they've added a functionality where you can just export very quickly a file that has all the text in it that needs to be translated. There are advantages and disadvantages to both sides. If you're manually creating screenshots as an e-learning technologist, you know the resource, you know which parts of it actually do need to be localized. Sometimes there are things on the screen that that the software sees as text because you've used text, but it's not actually text. It might be something you're using as an image or a symbol or whatever. And so if you're doing it, you have that control of what you're asking for the translations for. It also, however, on the other flip side, when you receive back a file with lots of tables on it, you have to manually go through the software onto every screen and copy and paste every bit of text and find every bit of text. That might not be as easy as it sounds. So a document that you can easily export and import is obviously a very useful tool. However, there are elements that, as a Dragos insinuated earlier, not everyone in the e-learning developing world knows exactly how multilingualism and translation and localization work. So the elements that I think could be improved upon, for example, there's no context when you receive this file, it's just strings of text. So they might come out of text boxes, it might be a single word. So I think from the partner's point of view, you often need to search around and look at the resource very carefully to know how you're going to translate. I know words I know in my languages. If I just saw bank and said translate that, well, I wouldn't really be going into Spanish. But if you just saw bank and had to put that into Spanish, well, it depends what you mean. There's different words in different contexts. So there's elements like that, and you also have to be aware there are some things that actually refer to elements in the software. So things might change the slide titles, which is fine if you've got a technologist in your country and then the title of the slide has changed to the title in German or French or Lithuanian. But if it's coming back to an e-learning technologist who has English, then you don't want all of the metadata within the software to have changed. So things like that that you need to be aware of and know how you're going to work around. So I'm going to move on to just some technical tips about creating e-learning for localization and things to bear in mind that I've kind of moved on to. And this is just an example of the software I've been talking about, Articulate Storyline. And you can see there the whole working environment is, as I said, is quite user-friendly. It looks like quite a lot like PowerPoint and was designed to do so. And just a close-up, this is one of the German resources, so I hope the partners don't mind that it's up there. But what I wanted to point out really is the fact that when you go into it, you've got this timeline of different objects. You can see nurse's hat, policeman's hat. So that's what I meant. You don't want things like that to change and be localized. But you can see where different text appears on the slide. But when you look at the slide, it's all sort of on top of each other. So I'm just going to go back so that that's not distracting. But the idea there is the difference between the working environment that the technologist sees and the working environment that the localizer or the user sees can sometimes lead to miscommunication. So for example, where it says this on the text might be difficult for some e-learning designers to find, especially if they don't have languages, because there's just a lot of text on top of each other. So this, again, is where thinking ahead and planning helps and being able to communicate, and that's something that I must say is the whole time I've been working on the project, I have to raise my hands up and say thank you to all the partners for how communicative, how much time they put into explaining what needs doing and where, because whenever you've got two different industries almost trying to work together on a project, they're looking at it from different perspectives and different languages. So that cooperation and coordination is essential to make sure that it works smoothly and you get the process you need at the end. And I'll just finish with a couple. I was going to put in some more technical ones, but I don't think they're necessarily as useful for everybody here. So one thing to watch out for when you're creating localization, and it links again to the red herring idea, is watching out for linguistic or cultural specificities, things that won't mean as much and then will twist what the localizers can do. That said, you bear in mind that people are adapting it. So sometimes we've put out a resource and one partner has come back and said, we actually want to change it quite a lot because a lot of the points that were included in that aren't as relevant for our users, but there are some other elements that we would like to have in there. So that flexibility, I think, is key to make sure if you're going to be putting in the effort and the time to put something into languages, as Dragos said, that you're actually putting it into a form that's useful for all the users. And the last thing does kind of link to the technical side, whether it's someone on the team using the software or it's a technician somewhere else, is avoid things that are locked in. We have elements where the designer has created something in Flash and embedded it into the resource. And if that needs changing, there's nothing we can do. There's nothing we can do with it. You need to go back to the person with the skills and start again and redesign. that could be something as simple even as turning text into images, which can be very tempting when you want the text to work a certain way on your screen. Then you need to change it, you need to go back to the files and you haven't necessarily spotted it, or it hasn't been exported into your translation file because the software doesn't pick it up in text as text. So that really all boils down to an idea of planning, an idea of looking ahead and at every stage, stopping and remembering, okay, how is this going to work for partners? When we take this link, what are partners going to do? Are they going to use the same English resource? Are they going to find an alternative resource, etc.? And just, I said that was the last one, just to add one quick one in, one for the road. Prescriptive scripts. And we say that prevention is better than cure. I think that prescription is also better than confusion. It doesn't mean that you're saying you have to do it this way, but if your scripts are very clear about what you're doing, then it's a lot easier, from the feedback I've received, for the partners to go away and either reproduce it or adapt it or a mixture of the two. And this includes things such as labeling your files, labeling your slides, so that you can have that communication and that dialogue about what needs to happen where. So if someone is more interested in the more technical side and the things we've learned, especially with regards to storyline, I'm happy to have that discussion afterwards. But I hope that there's been something in the principles there that everybody's been able to pick out and use. Thank you.